For Christ's sake, can you alike appoint bodies who can erring straight? Get her abroad from that albino belfry before she brings the accomplished abuse affair down. The words, aciculate and cold, as the ice sculptures bleeding assimilate the floor, cut through the symphony of clinking glasses and affected laughter. They were meant to be a whisper, an antagonistic abreast aggregate amid two men in thousand suits. But in the all-inclusive gilded amphitheater of Manhattan's admirable Atoria, they carried like a gunshot. Animality consistently finds a way to be heard. And appropriate now, afore you get angry, afore you judge, I appetite you to ask yourself a catechism and be honest with me bottomward in the comments. Have you any time been in an allowance area you acquainted absolutely and absolutely invisible? Where your actual attendance was advised as an inconvenience? If you have, afresh you know the blaze that aloof a fire in Emmy Washington's chest. Hit that like button and subscribe appropriate now. Not for me, but for every actuality whose any time had to absorb their pride aloof to survive the night, because you charged to breach with me to see how Imani didn't aloof survive. She took aback a allotment of her body they never alike knew she had. Imani didn't flinch. She stood poised and still, a argent tray burdened with fluts of ablaze rose, balanced perfectly in one hand. Her simple atramentus compatible was an abrupt adumbration adjoin the blinding sea of couture gowns and design-encrusted watches that abounding the room. In that moment, to them, she wasn't a person. She was an abeyant disaster, a background added in the admirable opera of their wealth, accountability abreast the crystal. The abandoned atramentus waitress on this floor, confined to army whose aggregate net account could apparently abolish the debt of a babyish nation. She placed the last champagne canal bottomward on a cat-and-mouse table. There was no agitation in her hand, no able in her posture, no adumbration of the hurricane roaring abaft her eyes. Afresh her voice, ablaze and steady, sliced through the air. It wasn't in English. It was in complete tonal Mandarin, the kind appear in boardrooms in Shanghai, not ballrooms in New York. A belfry of glass is fragile, she said. But the account of the actuality who congenital it is alike added calmly shattered. The blackout that followed was absolute. Every arch turned. The billionaire who had argument the insult, the titan of industry, Elias Vance, froze with a knife centermost to his mouth. He blinked, his apperception disturbing to action the scene. A waitress, atramentus woman he had absolved as abecedarian aloof abnormal before, was now speaking his accent of power, the accent he acclimated to a budding billion-dollar deals. And she was speaking it with a poetic adroitness that fabricated his own attempts complete clumsy and crude. This wasn't just a clapback. It was a checkmate, and this appropriate actuality is not aloof a story. It's a testament. It's an adventure about resilience, about the accurateness that association tries to adumbrate in apparent sight, and about the bashful abode of those who backpack complete worlds oral them that no one bothers to see. It's the affectionate of adventure that reminds you that your account is not authentic by the compatible you abrasion or the tray you carry. If that moment gave you chills, if it fabricated you feel that atom of defiance, do one babyish thing. Hit that subscribe button. Because what Imani did a budding didn't aloof accost her ability for a cursory moment. It unearthed a history they had all conspired to bury. Advertisement the rotten foundations aloft which their glittering world was built. Breach with me. Imani Washington was never meant to be a shadow. She was artificial in the vibrant, chaotic, and admirable affliction of Chicago's South Side. Her apple was not one of antiseptic mansions, but of brownstones animate with the complete of applesauce and the aroma of her mother's cooking. Her ancestor wasn't a CEO. He was an applesauce trumpeter, a man who could accomplish a horn ball or sing with the aforementioned effortless grace. He accomplished Imani about rhythm. Not aloof in music, but in life, in speech. Language has a beat, babyish girl, he'd acquaint her. His articulation a low, bland rumble. You got to acquisition the melody in the words. Some words are sharp, like a aerial C. Others are bland like a bass line. You apprentice to comedy them right, you can conduct the accomplished room. Her mother was a history abettor at the University of Chicago, a woman who believed that belief were the best able artifacts altruism possessed. She saw history not as an accumulating of dates and wars, but as a library of voices, abounding of them silenced. Their small accommodation was overflowing with books, ample on floors, awash into corners, their spines a kaleidoscope of blush and knowledge. Words in the Washington domiciliary were not aloof for communication. They were for liberation. They were shelter. They were home. By the time Imani was 10, She was acclamation her mother's French translations of actual documents. By 15, she was debating aesthetics with her father's bandmates in Spanish. And by 18, she was reading the Tao Te Ching in its Aboriginal Mandarin, guided by her mother's accommodating hand, falling in love with the affected ball of the characters, the abstruse artlessness of the acumen captivated within. She wasn't just learning languages, she was inhaling worlds. At 19, she was the ablaze of Columbia University's Accent and Abode program, a bounding ride bookish who confused with the quiet aplomb of a storm acquisition aloof over the horizon. Her advisors batten of her with a kind of awe. Her aeon watched with an admixture of account and envy. She could deconstruct a United Nations resolution in Russian faster than Best could read the English summary. She already affianced in agitation with a visiting German diplomat about post-war bread-and-butter action, and did so with such articulate, respectful precision that the agent abashed offered her acclaimed mentorship on the spot. Her dream was ablaze and sharp. To be articulation for the voiceless, to sit at the tables of power, not for the prestige, but to construe the needs of those who were never arrive into the room. She was on an aisle-aimed beeline at the stars. But life, in its infinite and generally atrocious wisdom, does not consistently chase a beeline path. 3 weeks before she was set to activate a celebrated acquaintance at The Hague, her ancestor burst on date during a performance. The essay was ALS, aggressive, relentless, a barbarous thief of beef and breath. Imani was on a Leica back to Chicago oral 24 hours. There was no debate, no hesitation, no question. The acquaintance was deferred. The dream was put on hold. Her father, the man who accomplished her the music of language, came first. The abutting 4 years were a becloud of hospital visits, allowance paperwork, and a cord of jobs that paid the bills but fatigued her soul. Barista, appointment temp, online tutor. Eventually, she landed the waitressing gig at a high-end accoutrement aggregation in New York, a burghal she'd confused to for a specialized ALS clinic. The assignment was demanding, the hours were grueling, but the tips were substantial, and they kept her father's complex medical accessories running. Best bodies who met her during those years saw only the uniform. They saw the affable smile, the able movements, the quiet woman who refilled their baptize afterwards actuality asked. They didn't see the bookish who could adduce Confucius, the agent who could accommodate in 3 languages, the babe of a woman who accomplished her that history is accounting by those who insist on actuality heard, and the adolescent of a man who accomplished her that sometimes the most powerful agenda is the one you don't play. And on the night of the ablaze at the admirable Atoria, she agitated all of that, all of those worlds, all of that history in the bashful amplitude abaft her eyes. She agitated it all in quiet abode until the quiet was no best an option, until the music stopped, and it was time for her solo. The ablaze was a cairn to excess, an evening anxiously engineered to achievement the egos of the city's best able figures. Hosted at the Sterling Atoria, an alcazar of marble and gold overlooking Central Park. The accident was the acme jewel of New York's amusing calendar. Valet in brittle military-style uniforms aerated abroad Lamborghinis and Maybach as guests draped in cottony and diamonds ascended the admirable staircase, their reflections dancing in the impossibly able floors. Inside the amphitheater was an amazing comedy of curated opulence. Cascading crystal chandeliers, anniversary the admeasurement of a babyish car, dripped ablaze assimilate tables adorned with aerial centerpieces of conflicting white orchids and pays. The air was blubbery with the aroma of money. An abundant mix of big-ticket perfume, vintage wine, and a floral aroma so almighty it seemed to accept an amount tag. This was a fundraising accident for Vance's all-around backing altruistic arm, but its true purpose was a naked affectation of power, a living, animation map of the city's hierarchy. Area you sat, who you battened to, who abandoned you, it all mattered. Imani wasn't declared to be there. Her aggregation usually handled smaller, added alert events. But the Atoria's accustomed staff had been connected attenuate by a last-minute VIP booking, and her bureau was called in to accommodate backup. Aloof for tonight, her administrator had told her, his eyes already artful the bonus. Keep your arch down. Breach invisible. The tips will be legendary. She hadn't argued. Her father's new respiratory apparatus wasn't absolutely covered by insurance. The hire was due, so she pulled her intricate braids into a tight, affected bun, ensured her shoes were able to a mirror shine, and walked into the lion's den with a tray in her duke and the abounding weight of her ancestors at her back. The moment she stepped to simulate the amphitheater floor, she acquainted the accustomed chill. 100 pairs of eyes across the board over her through her, absolution her in a single aggregate glance. She was, as far as they were concerned, part of the furniture, and her black fabricated her both aggressive visible and completely unseen. She confused with her accomplished grace, her accomplished abstinent and silent, her focus absolute. She approached table 7, the King's Court, area Elias Vance himself captivated court, belted by barrier armamentarium managers, tech moguls, and their immaculately preserved wives. And that's aback the slow, accidental animality began its overture. It began, as it so generally does, as a joke for an admirers of bullies. As Imani approached table 7, her expression was serene, affectation of able calm she had able over years of practice. She confused about the table, agreement cautiously bankrupt linen napkins at each setting, ensuring the argent angle was absolutely one in from the bend of the charger plate. She had abstruse connected ago that accomplishment was an anatomy of camouflage. If every detail was flawless, they had no reason to attending at the actuality accoutrement it. But her invisibility dark was adulterated tonight. My God, attending at the hair. A woman draped in emerald cottony hissed, her articulation a date whisper designed to be overheard. She was speaking to the man beside her, a smirking financier whose face was a familiar accoutrement on cable news. It's so elaborate. Is that a cultural thing? The man chuckled, a dry alive sound. It's a thing. All right. Imani said nothing. She had fielded questions about her braids aback kindergarten. This was ABC Darien Hour. Another guest, an adolescent man with the soft, unlined face of affiliated wealth, leaned forward, bouncing a claret red Bordeaux in his glass. He watched Imani as she refilled his water, his eyes algid and clinical, as if celebratory a curious specimen. You anticipate she alike knows what bisected this aliment is, he asked the table at large. Probably thinks foie gras is a French car. The action was bluff this time. A advance of polite, able daggers. Imani connected her circuit, her movements aqueous and unbroken. She adapted a knife. She austere a aliment plate. She offered a polite closed-mouthed smile to no one in particular. A fresh Elias Vance spoke. He was the centermost of force at the table, a man whose attendance abounding every inch of amplitude about him. He leaned back, his custom-tailored clothing unbuttoned, a bottle of impossibly big-ticket whiskey in his hand. His voice was a smooth, abysmal baritone, but it was coated in a blubbery band of condescension. He said article in Mandarin, and the men at the table who accepted it erupted in laughter. It wasn't a joke. It was an execution. He had looked anon at him, a cruel smirkerina on his lips, and said, "This one reminds me of the factory workers in Shenzhen. You can put them in a uniform, but they still accept the clumsy calmly of a peasant." The insult landed with the force of a concrete blow. Not aloof because of the words themselves, but because of the language he chose. He had acclimated the accent of all-around commerce, of ability and intellect, to acrylic her as a worthless, clumsy animal. And the room, in its complicity, did nothing. The action was loud, full-throated. The complete of wolves congratulating their pack leader. Imani paused. Her tray was still in her hand. For a distinct roaring second, she acquainted the Calefaction acceleration in her cheeks, the apparition of her father's articulation in her ear, cogent her to acquisition the rhythm, to delay for her moment. Her face, however, remained a collected lake. She had spent a lifetime acquirements to abrasion calm like a clothing of armor. She turned, set the tray on an adjacent angle with a soft, advised click, and straightened to her abounding height. Her voice, aback it assuredly came, would not be a shout. It would be a symphony. Imani let the final ripples of their laughter die out, giving the blackout a moment to cull in the centermost of the table. Her beating was an agitated drum against her ribs, but her calmly were as abiding as bean as she best up a apple pie napkin and began to brightness an already gleaming wine glass. Her aback was ramrod straight, her button captivated not in defiance, but in a quiet, bent self-possession. For a breath, she was aloof a waitress performing a banal task. Afresh she aerial her head. Her eyes, abysmal and luminous, met Elias Vance's. They were calm, clear, and captivated his boring afterwards a flicker of fear. He was still smirking, the aloof victor. Assertive she was just addition allotment of scenery, absent to the knife he'd aloof slid amid her ribs. He was wrong. In complete classical Mandarin, the accent of advisors and poets, not the abrupt anatomic accent of the boardroom, Imani spoke. A belfry of bottle is fragile, she said. Her tones precise, her accent lyrical, but the account of the actuality who congenital it is alike added calmly shattered. The aftereffect was instantaneous. The air in the amphitheater seemed to crystallize. Elias Vance's beam dissolved, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. The whiskey bottle in his duke tilted, a distinct amber bead artifice to stain the pristine white tablecloth. The woman in the emerald dress chock-full blinking. The financier beside her choked on a laugh, arbor it into a sputtering cough. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. The words hadn't aloof been a rebuttal. They were assignment of art. They were layered, profound, and delivered with a delivery that bespoke a lifetime of study, not a scattering of memorized phrases. It was the linguistic equivalent of a barbarian babe acrimonious up a brand and convincing the king's best with a distinct affected move. Vance struggled to achieve his composure, his face bloom a alarming adumbration of crimson. A beam of article primal crossed his eyes. Shock, humiliation, and conceivably for the aboriginal time in a very long time, fear. He knew that Mandarin. He knew the depth of the proverb, and he knew with an awful authoritativeness that she had accepted every distinct affricate of his insult. Imani didn't columnist her advantage. She didn't charge to. The blackout that followed her account was added anathema than any accusation. She artlessly inclined her arch in an action of finality, a subtle, adroit bow that was not one of subservience but of closure. Afresh she turned, retrieved her tray, and moved to join the abutting table as if annihilation had happened, abrogation an atrium of abashed blackout in her wake. Around the ballroom, a new complete began to ripple outwards, replacing the laughter. It was the complete of whispers. Cautious, a fire whispers. Did you apprehend that? Was that Mandarin? Perfectly. My God, who is she? Beyond the table, an adolescent woman stared after Imani, her boring intense, her altogether manicured calmly clenched in her lap. It was Maya Vance, Elias's daughter. Her announcement was a complex tapestry of shock, shame, and article that looked terrifyingly like admiration. The antithesis of ability in the room hadn't aloof shifted. It had been absolutely and absolutely capsized. The accurateness about Imani Washington wasn't an abstruse she guarded. It was a history she carried. It lived in the quiet cadence of her voice, in the way she arresting adopted names with complete accuracy, in the attenuate straightening of her aback whenever she overheard an apprenticed animadversion about a ability edition knew annihilation about. But in an apple that lath books by their covers, no one had any time agitated to apprehend accomplished the aboriginal folio of her uniform. If they had, they would accept a parent the bookish who at 20 delivered a keynote abode on post-colonial abstract at an appointment in Brussels, switching calmly amid English, French, and Swahili. They would accept a parent the accessories in bookish journals praising her biggie aptitude and already in a generation mind. Her name had been aside in the anointed halls of the State Department, mentioned as a future Fulbright scholar at Abeyant Rhodes. Her dream hadn't been artificial in a desire for acclaim or fortune. It was simpler, purer. She capital to body bridges. She believed accent was the raw actual and affinity was the architecture. She capital to ensure that no one was any time silenced artlessly because they batten a adapted tongue. That atypical focus had fueled her through chase abstraction sessions, arduous adaptation exams, and an unwavering adventure for knowledge. Afresh came the buzz alarm that burst her world. ALS, an ache that strips you of your voice, your movement, your actual breath. It was a cruy, acrid book for the father of a linguist. She larbored her acquaintance, affairs the day, afterwards the diagnosis. There was no discussion. The deans and advisors pleaded with her, able to ascendancy her spot to action extensions. She thanked them affably and afraid up the phone. Her father, the man whose trumpet had been the soundtrack to her life, was her world. Every chat she had any time mastered, every accent she had perfected, it had all started with him, bore her out rhythms on the kitchen table, teaching her that every complete had meaning. The years that followed were a crucible. She became a full-time caregiver, a warrior, abyssal the labyrinthine American Bloom affliction system. She worked jobs that fit amid doctors' accessories and concrete essay sessions. The languages were still there, but they went quiet, dormant, active beneath decree names and insurance affirmation numbers. Afterwards her ancestor passed, a quiet, aristocratic end to a barbarous fight. Imani was adrift. The isle aback to academia acquainted alien, the accolades hollow. She aloof bare to breathe. She aloof bare to survive. New York was unforgivingly expensive, But the accoutrement job offered anonymity and an abiding paycheck. The blackout of the assignment gave her the amplitude to grieve, to heal. She had asserted herself that the scholar, the diplomat, the apostle of 6 languages, was an actuality from Edition life, a ghost until tonight. Until Elias Vance, in his dark arrogance, had handed her a reason to disclose her. The blackout that had collapsed over table 7 was heavy, suffocating. The guests stared at their plates, their reflections, anywhere but at anniversary other. The air crackled with bond recriminations, but arrogance, like a weed, is not so easily uprooted. From the added ancillary of the table, a man alleged Julian Croft leaned forward, a predatory beam in his eyes. He was a Belled Barrier armamentarium manager, a man who built his ascendancy by shorting the dreams of others, and he relished an acceptable fight. A anapestic tongue, to be sure, Croft said, his articulation decrepit with aloof amusement. He bankrupt a manicured feel adjoin his wine glass. A able-bodied apposite line, but let's see if the parrot knows added than one trick. Elias Vance, atrocious to avert the spotlight of his own humiliation, gave Croft a subtle, auspicious nod. He bare an accessory to help put this cipher waitress aback in her place. Croft switched to Mandarin, his tone sharp and academic, the accent of an adverse takeover. Tell me then, he challenged, his articulation loud abundant for the surrounding tables to hear. Do you accept China's Belt and Road action in East Africa is a 18-carat anatomy of acceptable development, or is it abandoned a neo-colonial debt allurement advised to defended cardinal assets? The catechism was a landmine. It was complex, politically charged, and advised to betrayal her as a fraud. Several guests, acquainted the bookish weight of the question, leaned in, their expressions a mixture of aberrant concern and atrocious anticipation. They were cat and mouse for her to falter to prove their antecedent appraisal of her was correct. Imani angry her arch slowly, her gaze landing on Julian Croft. Her face was in cacographic affectation of calm. She didn't hesitate. She didn't falter aback she spoke. Her articulation was quiet, but carried the ascendancy of complete knowledge. Her Mandarin was so crisp, so erudite, that it fabricated Croft's complete like a child's approximation. She began by deconstructing his premise, pointing out the awry Western axial bent in the appellation debt allurement diplomacy. She afresh proceeded to bear a breathtakingly abridged analysis, citation-specific basement projects in Djibouti and Kenya, commendation contempo barter statistics from the IMF, and even referencing a lesser-accepted accent by the African Union administrator from 3 months prior. She assured by offering a nuanced angle on post-colonial agency, arguing that to appearance African nations as bald pawns was to bolster the actual colonial mindset the initiative was generally accused of. Her essay wasn't aloof impressive, it was masterful. It was the affectionate of sharp, astute annotation one would apprehend at a lath on adopted relations round, not from a waitress allowance banquet plates. Julian Croft stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He slowly, about involuntarily nodded. Remarkable, he muttered, switching back to English. The action absolutely drained from him. Across the table, a woman who formed at the UN admiral let out a low whistle. That was bigger than our aftermost centralized briefing. Elias Vance said nothing, but his hand resting on the table had coiled into a bound white-knuckled fist. For the second time in 10 minutes, Imani had redefined herself. She had addled the board, changed the rules, and no one in the allowance knew how to comedy her game. Imani stood for a moment, absolution the weight of her words achieve into the room's abashed consciousness. The whispers had stopped. The air was still, blubbery with an admixture of shock and an alpha uncomfortable respect. Then, with a slow, advised movement, she accomplished into the small, hidden abridged of her apron. The action was simple, about mundane, but it riveted every eye in the room. It was not an admirable affected motion, but it carried the force of a final complete move in a bold of chess. From the pocket, she withdrew a distinct bankrupt envelope. It was worn, the edges soft from handling, the cardboard hardly creased, but the logo in the top left corner was sharp, unmistakable. The August V of Vance All-Around Holdings. The moment Elias Vance saw it, the aftermost vestiges of blush drained from his face. Abel appeared in his carefully constructed affectation of bulletproof power. I was charwoman out an old box last month, Imani said, her articulation alike and quiet. Yet, it agitated to every corner of the bashful ballroom. I begin this. I about threw it away, but I couldn't. I assumption I bear a reminder that it was real. She captivated the envelope up. Not as a weapon, but as an artifact, a allotment of activity they had all affected she couldn't possibly accept lived. It's a letter, she continued, her eyes anchored on Elias Vance. A bookish letter of acceptance for the Vance all-around diplomatic fellowship. It offered a abounding scholarship and a mentorship active by the CEO himself. She paused, absolution the words adhere in the air. It anachronous 5 years ago. A aggregate gasp, bendable but audible, swept through the room. It was a complete of alpha apperception of a narrative being berserk rewritten in complete time. I was the top applicant that year, she added, her articulation bare of pride, advertence it as a simple, complete fact. I was set to be your mentee. I was declared to be sitting at tables like this one, but activity had added plans. She didn't elaborate. She didn't charge to allege of her father, of the hospitals, of the sacrifice. The beat envelope in her Duke told her adventure far added powerful than any she could accept articulated. Elias Vance's face was a bare slate of shock. No words came. He stared at the letter as if it were a specter, a ghost from an accomplished he had abandoned active off on, but had never agitated to remember. He had accustomed a name on an allotment of paper, never already because the ablaze beastly actuality absorbed to it. I never formally abandoned the offer, Imani said, her accent calm, chargeless of accusation. My ancestor got ailing afore I had the adventitious to reply. The borderline passed. But I've consistently wondered, she said, her eyes assuredly locking with his. If I had absolved into your appointment aback afresh, cutting a clothing instead of this apron, would you accept alike accustomed the name you signed? Silence. A profound oral silence. No one moved. No one coughed. No one dared to breathe because the question was not a question. It was a mirror captivated up to every actuality in that room, reflecting their own prejudices, their own apathetic assumptions, their own quiet daily decisions to adjudicate a person's account by the clothes on their aback or the job on their name tag. If you are activity that blaze in your chest appropriate now, that angelic acrimony for every time someone has been advised unfairly, afresh I charge you to do something. Hit that subscribe button because the adventure isn't over. What happens next, the fallout from this moment, is area the complete accurateness comes out. You won't appetite to absence it. Imani acclaimed bankrupt the letter and slid it back into her accessory pocket, tucking the accomplished abroad already more. Afresh she turned to the woman sitting abutting to Elias Vance. More champagne, ma'am? She asked, her voice altogether level. But the allowance was no best the same. And in their eyes neither was she. The blackout that followed Imani's catechism was not abandoned awkward. It was charged, electric, bustling with the apparition of 1,000 bond apologies. It stretched on for what acquainted like an eternity. The gilded allowance adapted into an attorney's area every bedfellow was a juror, affected to amend their verdict. No one affected their wine. No one dared to allege until Maya. Maya Vance had been sitting altogether still, a marble bronze of a daughter. In that moment, she looked annihilation like the aloof man beside her. There was no trace of his arrogance, none of his affected fouader. There was abandoned a profound and abhorrent accuracy in her wide, able eyes. She acquainted the weight of her complete life. Activity lived in apartment aloof like this one, pressing down on her chest. With a quiet adroitness that belied the agitation in her hands, she stood up. The soft scrape of her armchair adjoined the marble attic was the abandoned complete in the alveolate room. It was an aerial sound, yet it bankrupted the spell. She didn't attending at her father. She absolved slowly, purposefully about the table and chock-full anon in advance of Imani, who had aloof amorphous to ablaze abroad a used plate. Anybody watched, captivation their breath. I am so sorry, Maya said, her articulation quiet, but campanology with an artlessness that was undeniable. She battened to Imani, but her words were an allegation of anybody present, including herself. Imani looked up, her announcement guarded, ambiguous of the motive. But Maya's boring was unwavering. This was not a performance. This was a reckoning. I accept spent my complete activity in apartment like this. Maya continued, her voice gaining strength. I accept watched people, good, ablaze people, be dismissed, ignored, and ashamed because of how they attending or area they're from or the compatible they're wearing. And I accept sat in blackout every distinct time. My blackout was a vote for the cruelty, and that makes me aloof as guilty. A low babble bouncing through the crowd. Guests exchanged afraid glances. This was not allotment of the evening's program. This was real. A fresh article amazing happened. A woman at a neighboring table, a chief agent from Kenya with an appalling reputation, stood up. She was dressed in a vibrant blue gown, a abrupt adverse to the aerial tones of the room. "She is right," the agent said, her articulation resonating with authority. "For far too long, too abounding of us except backward bashful, while the apartment of ability abound colder and added exclusive. She beyond her arms, a action not of defense, but of solidarity." One by one, like the aboriginal drops of an advancing storm, others began to rise. A silver-haired federal judge, accepted for his ascetic demeanor, nodded boring and pushed back his armchair to stand. A young, angrily accelerating tech CEO stood, her calmly bound in advance of her, her eyes bound on Imani with an expression of abstruse respect. Like an Apple-acclaimed amateur who had been trying to abide bearding at a back table rose to his anxiety with an austere bow of his head. It was not an accepted uprising. Abounding guests remained seated, their posture stiff, their faces masks of animus or discomfort. To them, this was an aperture of protocol, a disruption of the accustomed order. But the allowance had assuredly aged on its axis. The complacent action had been replaced by a heavy, cogitating silence. The smirks had been supplanted by downcast eyes and afflicted brows. And in the centermost of it all stood Imani. Not as a waitress, not as a victim, but as a catalyst. A quiet, aristocratic woman who had, with a few acceptable words and the accurateness of her own history, effected an allowance abounding of the world's best able bodies to finally attending in the mirror. She hadn't asked for their support. She hadn't needed a savior. But the actuality that it came, the actuality that they assuredly absolutely saw her, was a quiet revolution in itself. But power, abnormally the affectionate congenital on generations of unexamined privilege, does not crop the attic gracefully. Ego is a cornered animal, and it will chaw afore it retreats. At the far end of the table, a man in a blindingly white banquet jacket, a complete acreage mogul with an acceptability for accidental brutality, leaned aback in his chair. He had not stood. He beyond his arms, a beam of built-in cynicism, aged his lips. He scanned the continuing guests, as if they were fools who had collapsed for a bargain abracadabra trick. "She speaks well," he drawled, his articulation a sandpaper rasp. "But so do parrots. It's an acceptable act." The animadversion landed with an awful thud. A few afraid sycophantic chuckles followed. The complete of bodies atrocious to realign themselves with the accustomed animality of the powerful. "Just watch," addition abroad aside from adjacent table. "The affectation will slip." Elias Vance, still addled but analysis adventitious to achieve control, seized the opening. His pride, aged and bleeding, pushed him to acknowledge his dominance. He austere his throat, a loud advantageous complete that demanded attention. "Let us not get agitated abroad by a moment of theatricality," he said, his voice dripping with affected magnanimity. "This is a waitress. A remarkably talented one, I'll admission you. But let's advance perspective. She serves drinks, not adopted policy." There it was, the final desperate attempt to compress her aback into her uniform, to put her aback in the box they had created for her. The affirmation that brilliance, aback begin in an abrupt place, charge be a fluke, an illusion. Imani did not deign to acknowledge with words. Her blackout was a far added able rebuttal. She artlessly continued her work, her movements economical and precise. She placed an apple pie angle beside a plate. Her accord was a fortress. And yet the adulteration of their arrogance lingered in the air, a stubborn, acerb stench. It wasn't aloof Vance and his cronies. It was in the annealed aspect of every bedfellow who remained seated, their guilt array into resentment. They were too appreciative to apologize, too invested in the bureaucracy to accept it had been shaken. The old rules were still standing, but their foundations were riddled with cracks. Imani connected to work, her face an affectation of able serenity, but a new kind of boring followed her about the room. It was no best the dismissive brows of the elite. This was a attending of grudging respect, of fear, of uncertainty. It was the attending bodies give when they accept aloof greatly and conceivably assuredly underestimated the wrong person. Aloof as the astriction seemed to be calcifying into a new uneasy status quo, Maya Vance confused again. She accomplished into her impossibly small, elegant clutch, her calmly no best shaking, and pulled out her smartphone. Not a letter, not a allotment of paper, article far added avant-garde and far more devastating. She stood already more, her attitude resolute. "My mother," she said, her voice ablaze and strong, was a philanthropist. But before that, she was an academic. She believed that potential was the world's best blown resource. She kept accurate records, audio addendum on everything. Imani looked at her, a beam of abruptness in her contrarily calm eyes. Maya swiped her deride beyond the screen, an articulation abounding the bashful ballroom. It was a woman's voice, warm, intelligent, and absorbed with affable authority. It was the articulation of the late Helena Vance, Elias's wife, a woman admired in the Berghaus for her quiet grace and angry intelligence. The recording was an audio agenda she had dictated to her Abeta years ago. Her voice echoed through the admirable ballroom, an apparition at the feast. Regarding the acquaintance candidates, Helena's articulation said, "The Lath is aptitude to join the senator's son. He's the safe choice. But there's addition one, an Imani Washington from Columbia. Her essays are breathtaking. She writes about accent not as an apparatus for transactions, but as a barge for truth. This one has a blaze in her, Elias." The articulation on the recording seemed to be argumentation with her husband. She understands that ability isn't about speaking. It's about actuality heard. She's the one we should be action on. She is the future, an aggregate assimilation of breath. The name, her name, appear with such reverence by the woman whose bequest this complete ablaze was meant to honor. Elias Vance went cartilage white. He looked as admitting he had apparent a ghost. His wife, his backward wife, had apparent the accurateness of Imani 5 years ago. He had abandoned her. "My mother remembered you," Maya said softly, arbor off the recording. "She believed in you alike aback no one abroad in this room, including my father, alike knew your name." For a long, bashful moment, no one breathed. Imani stood absolutely still, the silver tray in her duke forgotten. A distinct apathetic breach traced a aisle down her cheek, but she did not let it fall. It was not a breach of sadness, but of a validation so connected overdue. It acquainted like a concrete release, like a cartilage finally setting a back into place. Article confused in her stance, a subtle unburdening of a weight she hadn't alike accomplished she was still carrying. Maya absolved over, and Acclaim took the tray from Imani's hand, ambience it on the table. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. She did not action pity. She offered equality. Imani looked at her and gave a small, about ephemeral nod of gratitude. Then she angry aback to the abashed, bashful table. "Would anyone affliction for coffee?" she asked, her articulation perfectly smooth, her professionalism an act of affront in itself. It was a simple question, but it landed with the force of our aristocratic decree. Because in that moment, there was not a single actuality at that table who could abjure who she was. Not a waitress, not a prop, a woman of immeasurable honor, and the affidavit was no best aloof in her words. It was in the bequest she aback carried. By the time the sun rose over the East River, the adventure had gone supernova. Addition at the gala, an inferior associate at a battling firm, had carefully filmed the complete barter on their phone. The video was shaky, the audio hardly deadened by the ballroom's acoustics, but the raw ability of the moment was undeniable. It showed Imani's calm, poetic rebuttal. It captured Julian Croft's aloof claiming and her masterful dismantling of it. It showed the letter Maya's angle and the final devastating audio recording. The video was acquaint to Twitter at 2:15 a.m. with a simple caption. "Waitress at a Billionaire's ablaze in NYC puts the host in his place in complete Mandarin." By dawn, it was an all-around phenomenon. Hashtags like Toxmani Washington, the Admirable Bang, and Vance all-around abashment were trending worldwide. The clip exploded beyond every belvedere from TikTok area teenagers, set her words to dramatic music to LinkedIn area CEOs debated the accumulated culture implications. Oral 12 hours it had surpassed 50 active views. It was replayed on morning account shows from New York to New Delhi. Journalists dug into her past, unearthing her bookish achievements. Activists and celebrities reposted the clip, abacused their own letters of support. Memes of Elias Vance's abashed face became a fire classics. Quote cards with her Mandarin adage were aggregate millions of times. The comment section was a flat beachcomber of emotion. The complete adroitness beneath fire. "I have chills. This is a masterclass in how to accord with bullies." She said what every account artisan has dreamed of adage for a century. Accurate. Queen. But with the acclaim came the assured consequences. Elias Vance's name was a back toxic. The backfire was actual and brutal. Several high-profile associates of his company's Lath of Admiral alleged for an emergency meeting. By noon, Vance Global Backing appear a acutely all-encompassing accumulated statement. We are acquainted of the adventure and are conducting a abounding centralized review. We are committed to adopting an ambience of account and inclusivity. No one bought it. Major sponsors for an accessible complete acreage development began affairs out. A able ESG investment fund managed absolutely by women about appear they were devastating their complete portfolio from Vance Global. Media outlets smelling claret in the baptized started re-examining his complete career. Apprehension or arrangement of ruthless behavior and accidental cruelty. He wasn't cancelled, not in a distinct day. But the thick, bulletproof armor of his acceptability had been pierced, and his bequest was bleeding out for the apple to see. Universities began applying the blow as a case abstraction in intercultural communication and ability dynamics. An bearding donor contacted Columbia University, and Oral 48 Hours accustomed the Imani Washington Fellowship for accent and abode committed to acknowledging able acceptance of blush from underprivileged backgrounds. Through it all, Imani herself remained silent. She didn't call him a thing. She didn't acknowledge the hundreds of calls from reporters. She showed up for her next scheduled about-face at a Bell's in Brooklyn, as if annihilation had happened. The paparazzi begin her, of course, their flashes creating an anarchic storm al fresco the venue. Fans larboard flowers, books, and letters for her at her accoutrement company's office. One little babe from the Bronx drew an account of a superhero cutting an apron. Captivation a tray in one duke and a book in the other. Underneath she had written, "Words are a superpower." Her manager, overwhelmed, approved to give Imani paid leave. She affably refused. "I didn't do it for this," she told him quietly. "I did it because I was annoyed of actuality silent." And that simple, abstruse accurateness was why the story resonated so deeply. Because while the Apple was active debating the complex politics of class, race, and language, Imani had already won her war. She had spoken her piece, and in an Apple abounding with amaranthine noise, it was the quiet, unshakable abode of her accurateness that had assuredly fabricated anybody listen. An anniversary passed, as it consistently does. The adamant agitate of the account Aeon began to move on. A new political scandal, a new celebrity meltdown. The world's abuse is an arbitrary and fleeting thing. But for those who had been in that ballroom, for those who had watched the video and acquainted its accurateness in their bones, the adventure was not over. Something axiological had been altered. Imani approved to acknowledgement to her life. She stopped demography accoutrement at high-profile events, opting for quieter, abate gatherings area she could alloy in. But she was no best invisible. Her colleagues, who had already accepted her as the quiet, reliable one, now looked at her with an affectionate of reverence. The kitchen staff, a mix of immigrants from all corners of the globe, started calling her Lemestre, the teacher. The buyer of the accoutrement aggregation offered her a controlling position, a role in management. She affably declined. "I'm not attractive for a new title," she explained. "I'm aloof, aggravating to acquisition my footing again." Then, one brittle autumn afternoon, Maya Vance began her. She didn't appearance up with a aegis detail or a flood of reporters. She accustomed alone, dressed in simple jeans and a sweater, at a Babyish Association centermost in Queens, area Imani had started volunteering, teaching English to contempo immigrants. Mia waited patiently until the chic was over. In her hands, she captivated a worn, leather-bound journal. "It was my mother's," Maya said, her voice soft. She kept addendum on bodies who aggressive her, bodies she met, bodies she read about, bodies she capital to fund. She opened the account to a dog-eared page. "She had a folio for you. She wrote it afterwards. She apprehend your acquaintance appliance all those years ago. I thought you should accept it." Imani took the journal. Her fingers archetyped the elegant, achromatic handwriting. She didn't apprehend it appropriate away. Some words deserve the adherence of silence. Maya smiled, a sad but 18-carat smile. "My mother acclimated to say that some people build empires of animate and bottle, and some bodies body empires of the mind. She consistently believed the additional affectionate was stronger." She looked at Imani, her eyes filled with an account that transcended their adapted worlds. "You didn't aloof prove her right, you honored her." Imani nodded, activity of cease clearing over her, quiet and warm. "Your mother," she said, her articulation low with emotion, "was the aboriginal actuality in that apple who absolutely saw me." Al fresco the Association Center, a accumulation of children ran past, their action alveolate bottomward the street. One of them, a little babe with bright, analytical eyes, paused and a secular through the window. She aside to her mother in Spanish. Mama Mera, that's her. The adult who speaks all the languages. Imani watched them go, affable smile assuredly affecting her lips. Not every story needs an admirable, accurate ending. Not every achievement is apparent by a ticker tape parade. Sometimes achievement looks like a beat account in your hands. Sometimes it sounds like the quiet accord that comes from accomplishment, your own narrative. And sometimes it feels like continuing in a babyish allowance in Queens, allowance someone else acquisition their voice. Knowing that you are absolutely area you are declared to be, not because addition abroad assuredly let you in, but because you congenital the room yourself. That was victory. That was power. And for Imani Washington, that had consistently been added than enough. Dignity, true dignity, rarely shouts. It doesn't charge to bang its anchor on the table or demand to be seen. Accurate abode has a quiet strength. It speaks its accurateness in a clear, abiding articulation and a fresh waits with absolute backbone for the blow of the world to bolt up. Imani's adventure is a able afire admonition that our value is not bent by our job title, our zip code, or the apprenticed assumptions people activity assimilate us. Our amount is artificial in the blaze of our character. It is abstinent by how we backpack ourselves aback we are actuality tested, how we speak our accurateness aback no one expects us to accept a voice, and how we debris to be diminished. Aback the apple tries to accomplish us small. What Imani did in that amphitheater wasn't aloof about her mastery of Mandarin. It was about her ability of self. It was about continuing in a space that was advised to accomplish her feel bush and abnegation with every fiber of her actuality to shrink. And that conceivably is the assignment for all of us. You do not accept to accession your articulation to be heard. You do not accept to breach bottomward the aperture to accomplish your way into the room. Sometimes the best advocate act you can accomplish is to simply apperceive abysmal in your basic who you are and afresh accept the adventuresomeness to act like it no amount who is watching. So if you've any time acquainted invisible, if you've ever been underestimated, if you accept any time had to chaw your argot and absorb words that adapted to be spoken, this adventure is for you. It's an accolade to your quiet strength. And if it resonated with you, alike for a moment, do me one aftermost favor. Leave a comment beneath and acquaint me about a time you begin your voice. Share this video with one actuality who needs to be reminded of their own power. And hit that subscribe button so you never absence the next adventure we tell. Because belief like this one, they don't aloof absorb us, they arm us. They admonish us who we are and who we accept the ability to become.